So let's talk a little bit about making adaptations. And now we're really moving into some study skills and study strategies for students. We discussed in class the fact that many students need a lot of direct instruction in terms of how to process and manage the material that they're learning. And one of the things that we know is oftentimes it's not just special educators that need to make those adaptations, but it's also their general ed teachers, because we want all children to benefit from participating in the general ed classroom. And so one of the things that we know is that oftentimes teachers don't make very many instructional adaptations for students with disabilities. We know that takes time, that it often slows down instruction in order to be able to do that. And that some teachers think that making adaptations for the few students that need them isn't fair to the higher achieving students who are ready to go at a faster pace. So they teach to the middle and the above average students, but they're not really thinking about how do I make sure that I'm meaningfully including all of the learners in my class. Oftentimes, as teachers, we may be adapting textbooks. If you've taken Miss Cook's 4335 class, I know that y'all work on doing things like Text Compactor and Rewordify, but there are also other things that we can do to adapt textbooks so they're more accessible for students. I may need to provide some study guides or some more structured ways for students to be able to access that and process material so that they're ready for using that material and on exams or to produce other kinds of products. Highlighting is really a big deal. And I don't know how many of you, the first time you got your first highlighter and you went through and you're reading something and you found yourself highlighting everything. Did that happen to you? It happened to me. Highlighting is actually a skill, and we have to learn, what do I highlight and how do I use that to help me, reduce that material to its most meaningful parts. And we may also need to use some alternative reading materials. Sometimes we may need to use things in Braille, or we may need to use books on tape or other kinds of things. Okay? And then there's the issue of class assignments and homework. And one of the things I particularly want you to remember is that when we're going to do homework, we want that to be brief, and it needs to be focused on reinforcing rather than teaching new material. So students should have already been exposed to the things that we expect them to do for homework. Their parents are not responsible for teaching new material. Their parents should be responsible for giving them time and space to work on tasks that were introduced in the school classroom. And what you don't want is for homework time to become a huge battle. And I know everybody at some point has battled their parents or their children, or that's a common source of argument in families. But if we give enough information about assignments and we motivate students to do things and we give them some reinforcement from doing them well, we work with children on how to use planners and manage their time, they can be more successful. One of my children had an excellent math teacher in the 3rd grade, and she worked with a group of very high achieving students, and she was always challenging them to really think about math in more complex ways. But one thing she didn't tell us all is she often sent home problems that it was not possible to solve. And so we would sit at the table for hours and hours and hours and couldn't figure it out. And then eventually we'd find out, oh, well, there is no way to really find a solution to that problem. She just wanted children to think about it. Well, it would have been more helpful as a parent to have known that up front, right? Teachers are asked to construct and to adapt tests. And when we think about constructing student-friendly tests, we're really thinking about all the learners in our classroom and how we can give them access to being able to do their best. We can think about how we adapt test administration. So is this a student who needs to take it in a quiet place or need to be given more time? And then I have to think about scoring. So for some students, I may count grammar and spelling. For some students, that may not be the most important consideration. And I'm just looking at content and whether or not they have that. And then remember that it doesn't always have to be a paper and pencil test in which I use to assess a child's knowledge and skill. I can have them put together portfolios and do other things. And lastly, there are actually skills associated with test taking. We reviewed some of those in class, if you will recall, but I want you to remember that not all children process that immediately, okay? In class, we discussed these 3 types of study skills, that there's personal development skills, things like self-discipline, managing and organizing myself, monitoring and reinforcing myself. I'm very good at that for doing my own work, you know. Unfortunately, I often reinforce myself with things I should not eat, but that's, you know, a different issue. And developing sort of those positive attitudes toward being able to get something done. So a lot of it is, you know, what's my frame of reference and my mindset toward approaching a study skill or a task. Then there are process skills. I have to be able to take notes or outline or get information from a text or use the library effectively or go online and find relevant information. Those are all the processes I have to be able to work with. And then I have to be able to express what I've learned. So I can discipline myself, I can go through the process, but then I have usually to be able to produce something that indicates what I've learned. And so there has to be some retrieval. It may be related to demonstrating knowledge on a test. It may be using oral or written expression to demonstrate my understanding. I may have to do a presentation, or I may have to write a paper, right? All kinds of ways in which I may express my knowledge. I think time management is something that we can all work on. I know that it's real important for me to think about how to manage my time during the week. I'm never always doing it well, and I'm typically behind on at least some of the things I have to do. I have to think about how I'm spending my time. There's a really interesting, and I'm not sure that I can pull it up well, but go ahead and click on this link and go through and estimate your own time use during the day. And sometimes you find some pretty surprising things. I remember when I was teaching at UT, I had a student who said, I just can't do this program because there's just too much studying to do. And so we went through and actually kept a catalog of how she spent or documented how she spent her time. And she found out that there was actually a lot of time during the day that she wasn't spending wisely. And once she worked on that, she did just fine in the program. I think that you have to think about, you know, one thing I'm really bad about is I'm working on something and an email pops up and I go answer it. And they actually say that you're much better off if you give yourself time periods during the day in which you respond to emails rather than keeping it on all the time. There's lots of things we can learn about time management. Estimating time. I almost always think I'll be able to do something in less time than it actually takes me. And I think that's really important skill and to develop. Scheduling myself, being able to think about how to allocate my time so that I use it well, and then monitoring and making sure that I'm keeping a list of the things that I have to do so that they actually get accomplished. Those are probably all things that you all do very naturally. I know many of you do, but I also know that, like me, many of you procrastinate, and so you have to be really careful about how you allocate your time. Much of the rest of this slideshow is really lots of different strategies for managing and reinforcing time and getting tasks accomplished. I want you also to think about the process skills that are involved and that your book talks about. They talk about strategies for listening and taking notes, for doing an outline, for being able to look at information in a text and being able to skim and being able to scan and be able to use that material. Those are strategies I know all of you use all the time. Again, we have to do research and often go to the library and develop those kinds of skills. And sometimes it's also really important to teach kids, who do you ask when you're having those difficulties or when you're not able to access the information that you need. We talked about slant in class. This is a note-taking task, and we also talked about being able to teach kids how to look like they're paying attention and how important that is in terms of social acceptability. Lots of strategies for explicitly teaching note-taking. Sometimes we can begin kids with what we call guided notes, where we provide a framework that they fill in and we gradually withdraw that scaffold and they take more and more responsibility for that on their own. So again, these are things that you can look through and think about yourself. Teaching how to use text and for what purpose, particularly content area textbooks. So what am I can create a list of items to ask myself as I'm going through. I can ask if that list is complete. I can note the main ideas and details with the tree diagram. Remember when we used tree and task in class, for writing and discovering the main idea and related component parts. Describe those parts, and then overlearn so that I practice it and practice it and practice it until I can recall it on a test. Many of you probably use those kind of strategies. I'm not going to go through each one of these strategies. They all have acronyms to help children. Remember, our goal is we don't only teach the content, we teach the strategy. And as I mentioned, with many of these study skill strategies, not only do we teach them, but we need to help children discover what works best for me, because the strategy that works best for one student may not be the strategy that works best for another. Here are again strategies related to skimming and scanning, both of which are critical to learning and study. Think about how many times in high school you were given a chapter to read that you were to answer questions about, or you were to do something in order to demonstrate your understanding of that information. So again, skimming and scanning can be very helpful, because sometimes even if I read it, I got to figure out, oh, where was that? How do I find that information, etc. Okay. There are visual aids that students can use, types of graphs they can complete, and other things that they can use to help them organize that information that they've gotten in order to be able to process it, assess it, and take it back. Okay, and here are some of those. Like I said, this is stuff that you can go through. Multipass is a strategy that has a tremendous amount of research behind it. Children survey the material, they size it up, they sort it out. Your book does a wonderful job of describing that process. And then you can do some modifications to Multipass, so you can highlight or audio tape chapters and teach children how to do that. You can go through and mark things in audiobooks just like you go through and highlight things in a text, right? Students complete organizers or outlines. It's also important, I think, today to teach children to annotate digital copies of information. Okay. Again, I'm not going to go through all of that. We, the other day, talked about expression skills and being able to retrieve information. I don't know if you remember that I had you go through and look at these words and then try to write down as many of them as you could. And we talked about the strategies that students might use to be able to do that. And again, the issue is finding what works for that individual student. And so there's lots of different ways to rehearse what I'm going to have to produce. And helping children know that it's not just like you're going to read the text and then you're going to remember it all and then you're going to make 100 on the test, right? We talked in class the other day about that some of you didn't really have to study until you got to the university, and then it was quite an eye-opening experience. And probably a lot of what you were doing was figuring out, how do I really rehearse so that I'm prepared? It's not just a matter of reading it once, but I have to then take that material and go over it multiple times in order to make it my own. And I want you to pay particularly attention to the fact that we need to teach kids that it's important to do several short sessions rather than try to get it all in one, 2-hour cram session before the test. Sometimes that will work for you in terms of being able to pass the test, but it rarely works in terms of long-term retrieval of that information. We talked about Pirates and ACE in class. You've got some other examples here of some test-taking strategies. I want you to go through and use those. And then I particularly want you to pay attention to, how do you as a teacher evaluate your own teaching of that strategy? Okay? So remember, you have to state what is expected to be learned. You have to talk to children about when and where they're going to be able to use that strategy and list the sequence of steps that are required. You have to model the mental process. You have to show them, how do you do it? And you have to talk it through. Think out loud. Show them how it will be done. And make clear that this is one strategy, may work for them, may not, but you need to teach it until they can use it fluently, okay? In the middle of the lesson, you have to make sure you provide an adequate number of examples, and kids have an opportunity to go through that you remind them of what's our goal. It's not just to learn the content, but it's to learn this strategy. Help them focus on how they're processing that information, and then gradually give them more and more responsibility to implement that strategy without any help. Respond when they're having difficulties or confusions, and make sure you're giving that feedback in a timely manner so that they don't practice in a way that's not efficient, because when we do that, oftentimes that becomes our go-to sort of way of working. You can reward students for awareness of the process, even if they're still not grasping the material. Are you using the strategy? That's great. That's the first step. Okay. Give them an opportunity to verbalize it. And again, make frequent references to how are you processing that information. Now, what did you do? How did that work for you? Okay. And then make sure that when you close that lesson, you have them summarize it. You talk again about when and where that strategy can be used in real reading or in real learning context. You can talk about alternatives or the way the students that strategy may be working for that particular student. Give them an opportunity to practice. And then give them, as you're going through and you're teaching content, have them apply that strategy. And again, the emphasis is on not just learning the content, but learning the strategy.